Well, hello and welcome to my underwater stitchy make-along. We're going to leap right in January and focus on fish. And we're going to get started by drawing some fish first. So go ahead and pause this video if you need to grab a pencil and a piece of paper. When you come back, let's draw some fish. So I'm going to give you 5 seconds to draw a fish. I don't want you to spend too much time thinking about this. Just draw a really simple fish. And then once you've drawn one fish, draw another one again, giving yourself 5 seconds. And maybe you drew a fish that looks something like this. It's a pretty standard fish-shaped symbol. And maybe your next fish looked a little bit like this. And even if you were trying to make them both look identical, they would not be exactly the same. There would definitely be differences, but perhaps you tried to make your second fish look different. Perhaps you put some fins on your fish. Let's add some fins here. I'm going to make the fins intentionally different on the second fish. And now they don't look alike at all. And now let's draw some more fish. This time, let's draw a long, thin fish. And if I made this really long, maybe it would start to look like an eel. And you can see it's basically the same thing, but just by changing the shape of the body, by making the body long and thin, it looks quite different. And let's do another one. This one will base this one on a triangle shape. And I'll add a tail. And now this one comes with this shape comes with built-in fins already. And just by making a few different variations, you can create all kinds of very different fish. Add some eyes to these fish. And now again, another one, this one with a circle. And this one starts with a wiggly tail, with more of a squiggly tail, just slight differences here. Tiny little fins, and this one makes me think of a puffer fish. And I can add some spikes. I could see myself cutting out this shape and adding some stitch spikes to it to make what looks like a puffer fish, perhaps. Now, how about you? Do you have any ideas for different shaped fishes that you could make? Draw as many as you feel like you'd like to. And now, once you've finished drawing some fish, we're going to go straight into cutting out a fish shape. We're going to use the fish that we drew as references, but not as templates. Now, there are two different ways to approach cutting out a fish. These fish over here, I cut out the whole fish, fins, tail, all in one piece. But an easier place to start, perhaps, is by cutting out each piece of the fish separately. So in this case, I cut out the body and those tail bits separately and then sewed them on. So that's where I'm going to start. And I'm using this orange color fabric. It kind of reminds me of goldfish or koi. And I'm starting out with cutting out an almond shape, or I don't know, perhaps an eye shape for the body. And I'm intentionally not trying to make things symmetrical. I don't care if one end is the same as the other or if the top is the same as the bottom. It's just a very rough shape. I can always refine it or make changes to it once I've cut it out. For example, here I've decided that one of those ends is going to be a little bit more rounded, and that's going to be where the mouth is. And the pointy end is going to be where the tail gets attached. And I'm going to look at the fabric and see if there's some spot that's already looking a bit tail-like that I just have to cut off a little bit. Rather than cutting out the entire shape, I'm going to use the shape that the cloth already is, the cut cloth already is, and make a little tail there. And this shape too, once I've cut it out, I can always refine it a little bit more. And I think I don't want it to be so flat across the end, so I'm going to cut out a little bit of the tail to give it a little bit more of an interesting shape. And then once I've cut my first fish, you have two choices here. You can either go with a contrasting color for your stitches if you want them to stand out, or a color that blends in so they won't be so obvious. And I would encourage you to do this one fish at a time. Don't cut out a whole bunch of fish first and then start sewing them onto the cloth. if you cut out one fish at a time and then sew it on, maybe you'll make some decisions about what you want your next fish to look like. So I'm going to start here and I'm going to sew this onto my cloth using a whip stitch or an overcast stitch. Now the way that that stitch works, I'll bring my needle up on the orange cloth and then I will go back into the background fabric right at the edge of the orange cloth, and I'll just loop around and around and around from front to back. I'll go in at the edge of the orange fish and then come up well into the orange fish. I don't want to come up at the edge of that cut cloth because then I might start fraying the cloth, but I want to take a good bite out of that fabric. And because I've chosen an orange thread, it's going to blend in with the color of the fish. You'll see the stitches, but they're not going to be really the focus of what you're working on. And I'm turning around the cloth just as I need to so that I'm sewing in a comfortable position. So I'm just going to go all the way around. And here, you know, this happens to me, especially once your thread gets shorter. It comes unthreaded and you just thread it back together. Of course, I'm not showing you the times that I fumbled around trying to get the needle threaded. I'm showing you the one where I got it back through that hole pretty easily. I've left the bit where I want the tail to go open so that I can easily attach the tail on there, and then when I get to the end, I'm not going to forget and go all the way around. I'm going to tuck the tail into that open end right now and then stitch around the tail just like I did around the body. And now that fish is well secured and it's not going anywhere. We will be embellishing these fish later on. For now, we're just sewing them down to get them attached to the page so they don't get lost. So if you do them one at a time, you don't have to worry about any of them going missing along the way. Now that I've finished my first fish, I'm going to repeat the process. I'm going to make another fish. And this time, this fish, because again, I'm not using a template, it's going to be slightly different. This one's a little bit smaller than the other one, perhaps a little slightly different shape, and it's exactly the same process. I'm going to sew this one on using a whip stitch or overhand stitch, overcast stitch, around and around and around. This time I started up at the front of the fish, at the fish's mouth, but I'm just doing exactly the same thing, going around the tail, attaching the tail and then heading back to the front. And I have not given these fish any fins. I'm going to do that a little bit later on, but for now I'm just attaching the body and the tail. Now let's try something a little bit different. Now I'm going to try a different shape, and I'm going to use those fish that I drew as a reference again and choose a different shape fish for this next piece, and I'm going to go with my round fish here. And you can choose whatever shape fish you want. Maybe you'll choose a long skinny fish, or I don't know, one of the other fish that you've drawn. You don't have to do the same one I'm doing. But one of the things that I noticed here is I'm cutting out the circle shape. That edge of the cloth will make a good tail shape there. So I'm going to make use of the little bit that I cut out there for the tail of my little round fish. And I don't know if you noticed, but the tail got covered up there and it's gone missing, and now I don't know where it is. I can see it as I'm watching the video where it went, but I don't know where it is. Now I'm looking for it, and that's what happens. These little bits of cloth go missing. But I found the place that I'm going to start stitching, and you're seeing my embarrassing pile of thread here. Now my plan is to use that little rat's nest of threads up and promise myself that in the future I'm going to keep my threads all neatly organized, but it doesn't really matter. So this time I've gone for a little bit of a contrasting thread. This time, instead of my whip stitches going just barely to the outside edge of my cloth, I'm having them go quite far into the background fabric, so you can see these little spikes, if you will, sticking out from the edge of my fish. And now, because I don't have a lot of this yellow thread, and I don't know why I decided to use this one, but I don't have a lot of it, so I'm doing this whip stitch in a slightly different manner. So instead of going around and around and around, if I go into the cloth on the outside edge, then I'm coming back on the outside, and then moving to the inside, and then taking a little stitch, and then on the inside, and then back to the outside. And it's just a slightly different motion, and you can either do it this way or the regular way, but this one uses up slightly less thread, so there's most of the thread is on the front side of this cloth. And I'm going to attach the tail here using a different stitch. I'm going to use a running stitch, which is just in out, near-ish the edge off the cloth, but not too close to the edge, because again, I don't want to start fraying the edge. So I'm not overcasting it, and no reason, it's just a different way. We'll do that again on another fish. And one more fish. Let's do one more fish. I think I'm going to use this triangle fish there for inspiration. I'm going to cut it out of this very light beige fabric. But then I forgot that it was supposed to be a triangle, and I cut out a diamond. But no matter, this will work as well. I'm going to look for a place that this will fit, and here I'm going to overlap it a little bit with this brightly colored space. And this one I'm doing with the running stitch, so in, out, near the edge of the fabric, but not too close to the edge of the fabric. You can either do several stitches at once and then pull through, or you can do one at a time, whatever you're comfortable with. And this fish, I think I'm going to leave the fins and the tail for later on. For now, I'm just placing this body shape, this diamond shaped body on my cloth. And I'm going to go all the way around. And you don't necessarily even need to secure them quite so well. You could just do a few stitches right in the middle off your piece of cloth, just so that they're held in place. And when we start doing our embroidery on top of them, they'll get secured more firmly to the cloth. I've had a few questions about other ways to secure your pieces of fabric while you're stitching, especially if you're a beginner and you're fumbling around a little bit. And you can certainly do things like place a pin in the middle of your piece of cloth. And somebody asked about using a fusible webbing. You can buy sheets of iron-on fusible stuff that you put between two layers of cloth, and then you iron it, melts, and it holds the pieces of cloth together. You can also use a little bit of a glue stick, and that'll hold your pieces of cloth together. But I find, because they're so small, by the time you've taken one or two stitches, they're held on pretty well, and they're not going to go anywhere. And now a bit of a challenge. I mentioned that there were two different ways to cut out your fish. Let's give this a try if you're up for the challenge. If you're happy just cutting out the individual bits, then don't worry about it. Just keep going with what you're doing, and make as many fish as you like in as many different or similar styles as you like. But I'm cutting this fish out freehand with the tail and the fins and the whole thing all together. That way I don't have to worry about losing little teeny tiny bits of cloth. And again, I'm going to find a place to place that fish. And I'm going to sew that fish on using a running stitch, which I've done off camera. But I have another invitation to you now. What do you do if you don't love one of the fish you've cut out? Well, you can always refine it and trim it down a little bit more, but here's an invitation. Why don't you cut it into two pieces? And that way you can make a fish that's swimming off your page, or you can make another one that's swimming onto your page. You get two fish for the price of one. What I've done is I've created the illusion that the scene is not contained within the scroll, that there's life beyond the edges of the scroll. So it's your turn now. Go and cut out some fish shapes and sew them onto whatever background fabric you're using, and I will come back with another video that shows you another way of making a school of fish next time.